Welcome, everyone. I can already tell this is the most discerning crowd in oral history history, so I am grateful that you are here. Please join me in thanking Mike and Esther Wilson for supporting this program. I tricked them tonight. They usually sit where they can throw things at me, but I'm over on the other side, making the toss a little harder. So, welcome to Oral History's live derecho +1 in the middle of a pandemic edition. We appreciate your patience with Mother Nature had her own plans for celebrating the derecho anniversary, and so we had to move a day, and we're grateful that you've come out here to be with us this evening. So, our guests tonight are John Myers of the Indian Creek Nature Center, David Janssen of the Bruce Moore Historical Site and Mansion, and we are going to talk about the derecho in general, and we're also going to talk about the ways that the derecho affected their organizations in particular, which I think is a good snapshot of how it affected all of us. It affected this whole community. Now I'm going to start by asking them where they were when the storm hit. But because I love the sound of my own voice, I'm going to start by telling you where I was when the storm hit. I was sitting at my dining room table, otherwise known as my pandemic home office, with my laptop in front of me. I was talking on the phone to my boss, and I was complaining about something. Now, the reason that I can remember that so clearly is because that's just like every day. I was complaining about something. And then I said, holy moly, it's gotten dark around here. And then I didn't have to talk to my boss for something like 14 days or something. Everything went completely dead. I almost suffered from complaint withdrawal during that period of time. But at any rate, I'm sure all of you can remember where you were. My first thought after my own home and my own family was, man, I wonder what's happening to all the glass windows at the New Hampshire Auditorium. They were fine. I'm sure that you had similar experiences, a sort of, oh my God, and then, oh my God, what's happening at my organization. John, you want to start? Where were you when you
I was at home, actually. I was still working from home, and my wife and 3 kids were there as well. I was actually on a Rotary meeting on Zoom, sitting on my front porch, and the internet started going in and out, and so I got inside, and we just made our way downstairs. But in full disclosure, I'm not like a go downstairs in a storm kind of guy. I had my family go down, but it was very frightening to it wasn't your typical Iowa storm at all, and so to feel the house, feel everything moving, it was you certainly knew something was different.
Yeah, absolutely. David, how about you?
We were back in the office by that time, but had the day off because I was moving my youngest son into his apartment in Iowa City for his sophomore year at the University of Iowa, and it was not a great time to be driving a U-Haul truck, which was a high vertical. So we were moving in with his stuff and with his 2 roommates' things, and we were on Dubuque Street, and my wife called me kind of panicking. This is really terrible. She was still in Cedar Rapids coming down, and what she was describing was not what I was experiencing in Iowa City yet. And we got off the phone, and we were heading to a friend's house where some of his things were stored, and the van was rocking. And we just pulled into the driveway. Again, this was sort of Dubuque Street exit, opposite of Iowa City. And we waited it out there. And you could tell it was substantial. It was still the 40 or 30 minutes in Iowa City was constant. It was like, wow, this is really a bad storm, but no clue about the enormity. And I kept trying to call my colleagues at Bruce Moore, what's going on? Did we lose a couple trees? Any branches down? How's the greenhouse? And I'd get these scattered reports. Their phone service wasn't working, and Tara Richards, our operations chief, was sending me texts it was almost like, you have no idea, just quit bothering me right now, we're dealing with something. And it took me 6 hours to get from, once the storm subsided, I jumped in my car and sort of aborted the move the boy in plan, zipped back to Bruce Moore. It took me 6 hours to get from Dubuque Street in Iowa City to 2160 Linden Drive.
Wow. And I think that sort of, I can't really process how bad it must be moment. I remember, so I live south of 19th Street on Beaver Avenue, and we went outside right after the storm and we looked up and down Beaver Avenue and it was full of trees, and we just joined our neighbors in dragging them because we knew Beaver Avenue needed to be clear. They make that very clear to us every year, so we were trying to clear Beaver Avenue. And it never occurred to me really that the devastation could be any worse than what I was seeing on Beaver Avenue, which was plenty bad enough. And to be honest, it didn't really hit me until I drove by Brucemore.
Well, and just driving, the opportunity to drive from Iowa City back in as you sort of entered that maelstrom, as you got closer and closer, and the I-380 was backed up to Shueyville.
Yeah.
And so I'd zip off and get off on the NX exit, and I'll get around it, and zip through, and I'll go up through Kirkwood and Bowling Street, and then that's backed up, and you'd go through these neighborhoods that clearly had just suffered this wave, and trees across, and just to have to navigate and go. What took me so long was navigating through the neighborhoods, over power lines, under power lines, around trees, onto people's lawns, around the whole traffic pattern. You got to see the whole. Not the whole, but at least the southeast side, you just saw all of that progressively as you were trying to get to where you were going.
Yeah. And John, how soon after the storm did you try to get out to the nature center?
I left, so the storm hit about 12:30. I left by 1:15, 1:30, and immediately knew that there was going to be issues because I pulled out of my driveway and turned onto the main street right by our house, and there was a big wooden play set right in the middle of the road.
You mean it's not there all the time?
No, and so I'm like, well, this is going to be interesting. And I first tried to go to our main campus location out on the southeast side, and I tried to go up Highway 13, and just I live in Marion, and so the traffic though getting just even to get to Highway 13 was a mess. Try to go down East Post Road, completely closed. So I kind of say, okay, I'm going to go to our farm location, which is north of Marion, to start with. And it took me about 3 hours to drive what is typically a 10-minute journey from my house in Marion to our farm, which is near Alburnett. And then I wasn't even able to get to the farm itself. I had to stop about a half a mile away and actually navigate through walk through a woodlands to even check and see if our staff that were there were okay, because there's obviously no communication. And so it was probably 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening before I got to the main nature center, and by then they'd gotten a few of the roads open, but we had staff trapped at the nature center because the Otis Road was blocked on both sides for about 4 hours before we could even get communication to them, as well as get anybody there.
And I have to think folks were trapped at Brucemore too, right?
Yeah, we have essentially 3 vehicular access points to the estate, and all 3 were blocked by a minimum of 3 substantial trees. I mean, substantial meaning 70-year-old trees. There was no way. I mean, it took 2 weeks to be able to drive a golf cart from the visitor center to the mansion. So by the time, as I'm driving 6 hours to get back from Iowa City, the staff's trying to cut their way out. So we had 10 staff people on site at the time, and we're built for maintenance and mowing and trimming. We're not built for lumberjacking.
Right.
And so we have a couple of chainsaws, but they had to cut their way out. By the time I got there at 6, they had just cleared a path. So staff was like streaming out when I was rolling in to go check on their houses.
Right.
Which I had already done before I came in. But it was 6 hours to get unblocked from the estate.
Wow.
Before people could get out of the nature center, the city brought through snowplows. They put on the snowplow blades and just pushed things out of the way, and that's how we were able to get through those first few hours and days, was just pushing things out of the way like that.
Well, and I'm interested in those first hours and days, right? You two are the guys that the staff look to like, okay, Captain, what are we going to do about this? What did you do first? How did you decide what to do first?
There was nothing to do but cut wood, in many
Fair.
respects. I mean, once we knew everybody was okay, like David said, that we couldn't even get to parts of the property, and in fact, until we could get to all of our property was probably in the January, February timeframe of this year before we made it. We have 500 acres of land, and so just prioritizing getting to the buildings was where we started, and we started with chainsaws. We were a little bit more equipped than Bruce Moore, but we still brought in a lot of extra equipment. And it was just, hey, let's make sure your team or your family is well taken care of, make sure your house is well taken care of, and then let's just cut wood and see what we can do.
Wow. How about it, Bruce Moore?
Yeah, I think it's a good synopsis. Or the best thing to do is cut wood. I think that we, as the director, you could tell staff was looking to me for answers like, what does this mean? What's the content? What's the future going to hold? And you don't have all those answers. And we jumped in as a staff and kind of jumped into crisis mode instinctively. We started the next day, the next week. I held court in the maintenance building lawn. Thankfully, by the way, if you remember, the next couple of weeks were really beautiful. It was kind of, the weather was nice, it was cool, and so we were able to be outside, which is a blessing with COVID still a factor. So we were able to have staff meetings outside and triage the day. And the program team, clearly we didn't have some of the programs going on, but we started divvying up the work and jumping in when we could. It's tricky when you get administrative staff going out and doing physical work. The insurance gets so. If I get hurt with a chainsaw, that's a much bigger issue than
The stagehands and hand
Yeah,
jobs
it's
say
a
the
bad-
same thing.
Yeah, plus we're not good at it. But we had to figure out what the steps were. So first priority was we need to be able to cut a path. We can't control the neighborhood, but if a fire truck can get to the property, we have to get the fire truck to the mansion. If the mansion
Right.
catches on fire and we can't get to the mansion, that's a problem. So we have to cut a path to the mansion to allow emergency access. Then the next phase is we have to clear the arteries so we can get to the estate to do our job for cleanup. So we had we sort of worked through administratively what the triage would be and what areas we were going to ignore for a while. Eventually it got down to, by the fall, dropping the hangers and what we, in a cold way, called widowmakers, the big limbs that were kind of swinging, to get them down on the ground, not cleaned up, and also keep people off the estate. That was a hard part because people wanted to see
Sure.
what was going on, but we didn't want them in the way and we didn't want them hurt. So the first few days absolutely was jumping in, pulling brush. At the other end of it, our program team led by Tara Richards was contemplating whether or not they could do anything in the next month. When the storm hit, we had a concert planned in the courtyard, and the courtyard was sort of encapsulated by a bunch of trees. And by the end of the week, we made the decision, based on the progress we were making, to hold the concert. We just felt like we needed to be bold about that. So Tara and her team started working on that, COVID mitigation, while we sort of jumped in with the grounds team and did everything we could. Find coffee, buy a new saw, go buy a generator, all the staff were sort of spreading out. If they weren't cutting, they were going out to find supplies or find materials or food or lunch or anything.
Wow. All right, I want to tread somewhat gently into this next question. Your organizations, like this organization, are central to the cultural infrastructure of the town. Of course, the actual hard infrastructure of the town was also largely destroyed or offline. I'm interested in what kind of support, if any, you felt that the city or the county or the state were able to bring to bear to help your organization specifically, and how quickly that happened.
You want to jump in first?
See, this is what I mean by gently.
Yeah. We acknowledged and we talked about dealing with the idea that we felt very isolated, and it wasn't. This is not to shame any level of government or anybody else, but we certainly had people. It was on one hand, it was so heartwarming to see people who were going through this in their own lives, as you all did. You all suffered something in that storm, who were nonetheless coming to all of our staff, nonetheless coming to try to pitch in. And that was, Roland's brought tears to your eyes. At the same time, we felt very alone because the enormity of everyone in the community had felt it. So it wasn't like we were going to have any different story than somebody who lived on the other side of Grand Avenue. But we felt within a couple of weeks like it had been passed over. Here's a story in that when about day 4, one of the staff said, "There's an AP photographer out front." And they were very, I said, okay. And so I went out and talked to him. He was from the Daily Iowan.
Very similar.
Yeah.
Very
But he had an AP pass, but he was at AP. And I said, "What can I help you?" And because we're trying to keep people off. He said, "My editor sent me up from Iowa City because everyone down there thinks they got it bad, and he wanted to show them." So it felt like even people from outside of Lynn County didn't quite know. And that was immediate, and it progressed the rest of the year.
Well, there was no national news coverage, right? I mean, and so the reality of what happened here was not felt by anybody else but us.
You're right about the national coverage, and I haven't seen, for example, the story that ran on GMA this morning that's about Next Page Books, but it apparently is surprisingly devoid of any mention of the anniversary of the derecho. And so you're right. I mean, I know folks reached out to Ginger Z and we're told, we like to get ahead of the storm, not after the storm, and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, my peers, most of whom live in Iowa City, really couldn't quite wrap their heads around what was going on in Cedar Rapids. So who came out to help at the Nature Center?
Well, isolation, we felt that isolation, but we also felt that for whatever reason, we had to, David kind of mentioned this, but volunteers show up that we didn't know why they showed up or who they were to pitch in and help. And so there was that side of it. Specifically from a government perspective, the only thing I'll call out there is that we were not eligible for FEMA dollars. I know Bruce Moore was, but the Nature Center wasn't because of our classification as an organization. And so our entire recovery is funded a teeny bit by insurance, but mainly by private donations. And so that was a little disheartening and disappointing that there wasn't anything available. But the reason being is they don't prioritize recreation, and that's where we fell.
So is the Nature Center not a 501c3?
No, we are. Yep. But there's rules. Federal governments have rules, and
yes.
They're always. We got kind of denied through that process. So, but I say that, but then in the next breath, I'll say we had overwhelming donor support that came to the table. And while we still need more, we received several unexpected gifts to our organization that were significant in helping with our recovery. And so people didn't just leave us there and say, hey, you're on your own. We were able to really use some of those dollars.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I want to concur with that too. I think that when I said we sort of brought tears to your eyes, not only the volunteers, but some checks would show up unsolicited because we weren't quite ready to ask for help. We didn't quite know what the scope was. But
sure.
To think about all of the things that everyone else was paying for and worried about and dealing with in the pandemic, as well as the storm locally, to get local donations was amazing.
Yeah.
And motivating, very motivating.
Very inspiring.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so it's been a year and a day now, so I assume you're both back perfectly to normal.
Yeah, perfectly.
Tell me a little bit about what the last year's been like and what direction you see everything going at this point.
Well, one of the things that we realized as we were all out cutting wood, what I realized, I guess, is that we need to know where we're going to go from here. Because not only were we living through a pandemic and the challenges that brought to our organizations, but we had just taken these huge hits, and we both have very massive properties. And so actually I took 3 days, and I went out of town. My staff had it. They said, go. I went out of town for 3 days, and all I did was think about what's next. You know, just get out of the woods and clear my head and say, where do we go from here? And that was the basis in late August for developing a year-long emergency set of priorities for the Nature Center. And they, of course, dealt with recovery. Our recovery goals are going to extend all the way through the end of 2023. But they also, probably more importantly, dealt with the opportunity that the storm gave us as an organization. And that opportunity, first and foremost, was a trail system. We have 5 miles of trails on the Nature Center property, and every single one of those was basically tore out. And so we had to really stop and think, do we want to just go through and clear these trails, or is this an opportunity to rethink the environmental soundness of those trails? Can we decrease erosion? Can we add more trails? Can we make them so that they are more user-friendly? A very specific component is how can we increase the trails so that they are more accepting and able to be navigated by those with physical disabilities? So it wasn't just going through and reopening the trails, it was how can we make this so that 10 years from now, this storm was a benefit for our organization rather than a bad thing. And the trails are one example. We have one of the other significant ones that came out of those emergency priorities was we are opening next month a natures-based preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds. It's called Creekside Forest School. And it came out of the fact that everything stopped. Every education piece, everything stopped at our property. And so once we got cleaned up, our education team took the ball and said, we're going to expand our reach to more children. And we're going to do things different than we were doing before. And we probably wouldn't have done that as quickly, I know, but with as much fortitude if it weren't for the storm.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. That's an exciting program, 3 and 4-year-olds out in nature.
70% of the time. So typical school year, if it's January and snowing, they're outside kind of thing. So that ability to learn from nature, I mean, nature just gave us a really big punch, but continuing to respect and know that this next generation needs, they're the ones that are going to make or break our environment going forward. And we need to give them all the tools possible to be able to make a difference. And this, starting at 3 years old, is how we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. I'm not sure about being out in the snow, but other than that's
You're welcome to come volunteer.
Thank you. I'll make a note. David, when I think of Bruce Moore, I think about what you and your predecessors and your staffs have done over the years to sort of make distinct cultural spots all around the grounds. And I have to think that a ton of that was disrupted, damaged in fairly substantial ways. And so I guess I'm interested, you've been going through this same, like, what do we put back the way it was and what do we do differently? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's very similar in that we, in the midst of the adrenaline of the immediate recovery, keeping people safe, removing debris, removing the danger, assessing the damage, we ended up, we do not have the extent, the extent of property that John's responsible for overwhelms me. I mean, the amount, and I'm a member of the Nature Center, and we walk our dog there all the time. We pick up after our dog.
Thank you. Good plug there.
Yeah. But the enormity of what they had to deal with just overwhelms me. And we had 26 acres. We ended up losing 450 major trees, which is 70% of our canopy. The landscape historians that we work with tell us that no historic site in the United States, now we consider ourselves a built environment. It was all designed and planted in a certain way versus a pure natural environment. No historic site suffered a greater percentage of loss in one day in the history of the United States. So we had to deal with that. And like John and his team, you've got people who work there who are there because they love trees and nature. John's entire staff is that way, but for us, it's the buildings and grounds team that instead of coming in and nurturing the gardens and nurturing the trees and nurturing the lawns, now had to remove it and cut it and come to work every day for months in what was essentially for them a morgue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the emotional and physical toll on them was enormous. So we really needed to, in addition to pivoting to what the opportunities were, which are enormous, we talked a lot as a staff about going through the mourning process, acknowledge the loss, get through the adrenaline, get through the crisis minute. We gotta fix it. We gotta cut that down. It's fine. Relax. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. Don't burn out. But acknowledging as a staff repeatedly in meetings that we need to get through this and grieve the loss, not only the loss of the property and 100 years of nurturing, but the loss of the potential for what we were planning to do in the next 5 to 10 years. And you've got to let that go. And like John, you're barraged with, when are you going to get back to normal? When are you going to return to what you did? We tried to talk very clearly about, it's not going to be. Now, there's tragedy in the pandemic and there is tragedy in the derecho. The benefit and the silver lining is we had to drop things, and now we can decide consciously what to pick back up.
Yep.
What's going to make the organization stronger, and what's going to enhance our impact on the community. So what can we do better? So for the events and the programming, we're very aware that the venues spaces, the Peggy Whitworth Amphitheater, which is surrounded by this massive grove of trees and not so much anymore, and the little rooms that we would stage things in were disrupted. We also, to acknowledge that we have this responsibility for the historic preservation, keeping in mind that just like Jason and his team and the History Center treat this as an artifact, it's not just a museum, it's an artifact. The structure is part of the resource that they have to take care of. We as well, and we consider the landscape just as important. Those elements teach us about history, teach us about the people who work there and live there. And our preservation mission includes that landscape. So it's, to answer your question as simply as I can, it was looking for opportunities to restore the landscape and replant in a thoughtful way that merged the historic designs that the Douglases put in place in the 19-teens, the contemporary use, because they did not plan to use that estate for, 1 million people since 1981.
Right.
They did not plan to use the estate for the way we use it. So are there ways we can merge the historic design with contemporary use, with the fact that when Mrs. Hall died, she had about a dozen groundskeepers. We have 2.
Right.
So there's a maintenance difference
Yeah.
in terms of what we can take care of. So that's the opportunity that we're looking at. How can we restore this in a way that's true to the history, beautiful, functional, maintainable? So it is like John, we tried to focus, once we got through the mourning process, focus on what are the opportunities to make the organization stronger and yet fulfill our preservation mission.
Yeah, I'm going to speak personally for a moment. What you're witnessing here, and I'll lump Jason in since he's up here, is enlightened nonprofit leadership, right? I've worked in nonprofits for a long time, and we always believe we're in a crisis, right? There's never enough money. You haven't sold enough tickets. Not enough people have come to your event. We're always in crisis mode. In fact, I believe that some nonprofit organizations feel like they have to be in crisis mode, that's who they are, right? And so for these gentlemen to know that what their organizations and their staffs needed was a little time to mourn, that's all too rare in the nonprofit world. So you have my thanks and applause, and I'll be sending in an application.
Well,
all right.
Thank you for that. I want to add something else to what you both are talking about, and that's the emotional side of this that is so easy to overlook. And I was struck by just how overwhelmed our staff, our volunteer, our families were throughout all of this. And to your point, looking to us, and I was out at our farm one day, probably a week or so after the storm, really still trying to process everything. And I was standing, we had this about 5 foot into the diameter tree that came down in the middle of the farm. And I was standing there cutting it. It was a maple. And as I was cutting it, sap just started flowing out of the tree to the ground. And it hit me very, very emotionally that the forest was bleeding, and literally sapped the blood, the life that runs through the trees. And I knew I had to take that opportunity because you know, a lot of times leaders don't say this, but I cried right there because I was so overwhelmed. But I took that emotion and I wrote it into a piece that some of you may have read it. We published it pretty quickly after the storm. And I did it not to capture my feelings so much as to capture the feelings of all of our staff and the community. You know, one of the things we started hearing right away was from community members who were contacting the Nature Center that we had never heard of before. And they're saying to us, my nature is gone. My tree in my yard. You know, maybe I don't consider myself a nature person, but so many people lost trees and realized that emotional connection that after the storm. And so it was a real thing. And people had a variety of ways of dealing with it. I know that one of the ways I did, and I think David, was I actually took a half a day, I don't remember, and went to Brucemore and cut. And then David came to the Nature Center. I don't know who did it first, it doesn't matter, but I wasn't
And
trying
you
to
brought
get
your
there.
daughter. My sons wouldn't come.
Yeah, my 9-year-old daughter came and helped. And that was important for me. I think it was important for you to be doing something for somebody else because all you felt was, man, look at what we have to deal with. And there's a picture of the two of us after cutting that I'll cherish forever, but
Me
only
too.
because
Me too.
you want to find people who understand what you're going through. And our staff had that same thing, and they all had their own moments that they went through. But it was important enough for me to tonight, as well as before, to not overlook that emotional toll that they had.
Yeah, and what sort of, it's a tricky thing, right? Employee mental health, team mental health. What sort of resources are available to organizations like yours that sort of go through a shared trauma like that?
First of all, I would say that having the pandemic had led to some pop-up support groups. So I mean, Jason, John and I, Sean Ulmer, a number of the nonprofit leaders in town, we'll gather via Zoom throughout the pandemic. So we had already kind of set up that infrastructure of how things going, and the nonprofit leadership in this town is very collaborative in my experience and very generous in what they share and what we share with each other, good and bad. And that was a resource that I can't overlook, having that. I think beyond that, there was also a national resource in those sort of peers outside from my industry of having that access. But I also, we were very clear. We had a couple of staff talk to us about their mental health and some very serious little red flags. And John and I are both friends with Emily Bloom of Foundation 2, and we were very quick to lock them into Foundation 2, suicide prevention and counseling, and there were some real issues that people were feeling. And as a leader, you have a responsibility for the health of the team that's doing the work, and trying to make sure that we're demonstrating good self-care,
Right.
And not burning out, but also making sure that our teams have access to what they need as well. That was a benefit going into the ratio for me, was that some of that infrastructure had been set up by the pandemic, that we were already sort of talking about, hey, this sucks, this is hard, and this is really hard to be a leader in this environment. But having access to Jason, to John, to Sean, to Lanisha, to having the people around you to talk through things was good. and then the storm hit, and we had that to lean on.
So here's another topic I'll wade into somewhat gently. It would appear that the weather in Lynn County is trying to tell us something, right? We've had a flood, we've had a derecho, we've had floods ahead of the flood, right? It's, you know, regardless of how you feel about the science, something's happening in in the weather, right, in this community. And I'm interested, particularly for your organizations that are both so, I mean, yours is nature and yours is embedded in nature. How do you future-proof? Can you future-proof? What do you do?
I don't know that there's any way. I mean, to your point, the UN just released their climate report yesterday. I haven't even read it, but I know enough to know that it's not good.
It is not good.
And there are a tremendous number of things that not only locally, but nationally and globally, the science can point to, and people can say that this is what's here to stay. I think, though, what's often missing in reports like that, or to make it more local in us planning for the future, is that concept of hope and of the tenacity of people. You know, I don't like hearing from any of our team, and they don't say this, but from anybody who's within the environmental world, that there's no hope. There's nothing else we can do. It's just done for. Because I don't think that accurately reflects who we are as a civilization. And I know very specifically that we're going to continue to do what we do, regardless. You know, we may have to adapt, but you know that you can't plan for a derecho. You can't plan for a flood. I mean, these were all things that you knew was maybe a possibility, but nobody in their wildest dreams would have ever guessed that. And we don't even know what that next thing would be. It's probably not another derecho or another flood, but it's probably something that is going to be just as bad. And I think you just have to do what makes the community stronger, makes your people stronger, and really what focuses on being a quality civilization.
I like that, a quality civilization. A manifesto by John Myers. I like that.
Just now written. Yeah.
Ted Kaczynski.
So, David, I feel like Bruce Moore, I don't know that lucky is the word that I want to use, but the mansion, the mansion came through fairly unscathed?
Well, if unscathed, there's 1.4 million in roof damage, and
so no.
So
no, Rob, it did not come through unscathed.
We had about 3 million in damage to buildings and grounds. The mansion roof, the breakfast porch imploded. We had a tree fall on the Lord and Burnham greenhouse. There are 7 historic structures on the property, and the entire property is on the National Register of Historic Places, so they're all qualified. Every building suffered something, puncture wounds or loss of gutters or loss of siding, or the Lord and Burnham greenhouse and the mansion probably suffered the most. But we're still, and not just the buildings, but the structures. So there's hardscaping, there are fences, there are piers. There are conservators right now working on a year after the storm. They started working yesterday on the baskets of fruit that are on the posts of the piers at the gates, both at the Linden and First Avenue entrance, but also at the courtyard. A maple tree fell on the knee wall in the courtyard and crushed the wall and tore so they're working on that right now. So it's the complexity of the damage to not only the landscape, but to the hardscaping and to the structures it's almost overwhelming. I'm blessed to have a really good team of people around me who carry my water, but there's an awful lot of intricate project management going on right now to get all of this done.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to open it up for questions, but before I do, let me give both of you an opportunity to tell us here a year and a day after the derecho, what can the community be doing that would be most helpful to your organizations in the moment?
I'll make a pitch. I make this pitch when I do curtain speeches at some of our shows, but the arts and culture community, the History Center, the Theater Cedar Rapids, Orchestra Iowa, Czech Museum, all of us here, the Nature Center, we have our missions, and I believe that as a subsector of a sector, we do great things as an industry to make lives better. I would never deny the importance of saving lives. I would never deny the importance and the primacy of health and human service nonprofits. I would just want the community to understand that the nonprofit sector writ large, including health and human service and arts and culture, we all took hits. And I don't think there's a nonprofit in any part of the sector that suffered a greater physical loss or because of the pandemic, operational loss than the Nature Center, followed by Bruce Moore in terms of the physical devastation, and that impacts our missions. So the only thing I would ask is that the community consider not only the absolute fundamental value in homelessness and medicine and health and welfare and making sure people are safe and issues of immigration and issues of safety, but that arts and culture and nature and history is not a luxury that you deal with later. That's part of what makes life worth living. And that's why we're in this industry. That's why we've committed our professional lives to it, Jason as well. And I would just want the community to understand that the cultural nonprofits sometimes are dismissed as not really business. So small business loans you're not really a business. We're going to go to the restaurants and bars. They're most important. They drive the economy. And then you look for help from foundations and sources, and sometimes as well, we'll deal with health and human service first. So we tend to be at the back of the line. We understand it, but I just would want our entire community to understand the value in what I think our staff, our members, our trustees, and our volunteers do, and the impact we make.
Yeah, he said that very well. I would just add on that collectively, the Nature Center succeeds when everybody succeeds. And so, visiting the Nature Center, visiting the Museum of Art, going to a play at TCR, engaging with the History Center, all of the different opportunities that we have as a community, we get stronger when they get stronger. And so we talk about this all the time, and David said it very, very well, that make sure that you're supporting arts and culture, and make sure that when we come back from the pandemic and when we come back from the derecho, that there's something to do that's worth living for.
Mm-hmm.
That's really well said. This community is, particularly for a community of this size, is a remarkable place in terms of its arts and culture and natural resources. And you both said it so eloquently, getting out there and whether you make a donation or just attend events or just use the services, you can continue to strengthen that as we come back from all these things.
And to be clear, John and I aren't asking to be saved. What we're trying to make people understand is that we're part of the solution.
Absolutely.
It's that places like ours, like Jason's, these organizations are part of the recovery. If you invest in them just as much as we're investing in bars and restaurants, that makes the quality of life and makes the economy better. So we're not asking for charity, we're asking for investment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to put it, investment. Yeah, I agree. Questions from the assembled masses? Yes, sir.
David, we'll talk a little, some of his structural damage. John, what did you have?
You may be familiar with our new building, which has been open 5 years now. That sits at the bottom of the hill. Amazing space, we call it, at the bottom of a hill. That hill provided extreme protection for that building, and Amazing Space came through without a scratch. It also helped that it was built of stone and cement, not vinyl or anything. We had steel on the roof, and so all that stuff came together and helped. Amazingly enough, the 1932 dairy barn, the Penningroth barn that the Nature Center grew up in, didn't take a scratch. If you drove by, there were trees everywhere. You couldn't get to the barn for 2 full days, but that thing stood. It stood through, and it is, it's an old building, so it's a little worse for wear, but it didn't have any storm damage. We had some outlier facilities on the property, so we had a boardwalk that was decimated. We had a variety of sheds and outbuildings and stuff. But our farm actually is what took the biggest hit, North of Marion. We had 2 100-year-old structures that just this week, they have started to come down. They're barns that were part of the donation when that property was given to us, and they shifted on their foundations and could not be repaired. We looked at all sorts of options. So the farm took some significant damage, and it was a little interesting because when they started taking those down earlier this week, you kind of felt that same emotion return to you, partly because of the storm, but partly because these are 100-year-old structures that can't be saved. And so that's kind of what we dealt with. We are going to be probably through the end of 2023 before our facilities are back up at the farm. But we're tenacious and we're working on it.
Did your solar panels survive?
They did. Oh my gosh. So Alliant, who managed those, us. We all thought, oh man, there's not a speck wrong with them. Now the ones that are in the field are really mounted well in concrete, and the ones on the roof just kept. And I don't know how that came through. We were very lucky in that side of things.
Yes.
Are there enough artisans and technicians and people who have the old standards and feet to maintain a place like Brucemore to the original standards, or does it have to be modified?
Are there enough? No. It's hard locally to get the level of craftsmanship. There's some very good people in the area. You make choices. There's a hierarchy that you go through with preservation of original material, like material, same quarry, and then you get into replacement material. Sometimes you deal with historically bad designs. Frank Lloyd Wright places have a lot of trouble with flat roofs are not great, engineering-wise. So you have to make, it's an incremental decision about that craftsmanship, but that's really hard. It's really hard when and that's for us, for historic preservation, when you lose original material and original craftsmanship, every little bit you lose is one kind of chink in the armor that it's really hard. So we have to be pragmatic about it. I can't stop we were working on the mansion restoration before the storm. We had a 4-year mansion envelope process dealing with the wood around the windows and doors. And we had to make some decisions about the percentage of original material. Do you hold up the entire project to save this trim, or do you we went window by window and made window by window decisions about, is it just the top that has to go, or is it just the whole window, or that's a balance, a tricky balance. But no, in general, it's hard to find the volume of resources. The conservation, especially with art and artifacts, we're dealing with Minnesota and a couple of other regional conservation consortiums, but it's really hard to find competitive art and artifact conservation resources locally.
Other questions? All right, so this is normally the part of the show for you regular attendees where we ask our guest to reflect on the expanse of their life and let their older self give their younger self advice. However, that is not the game we've been playing here today. So I'm going to ask a slightly different question. It's a very different question, if I'm being honest. Imagine that Jason is kind enough to invite us all back on the 2 year plus 2 day anniversary of the derecho, and we're sitting here. What do you hope to be able to say about your organization on that day?
1 year?
Plus
1 year.
2 days.
Well, I think what I know would say, what I'd like to be able to say is that we're not back yet. You know, I mentioned our recovery in the forest specifically is going to take several years. But I would really believe and hope that we have just as much support of the community, support of staff, of volunteers, of donors, because that's really what's making us successful today, and that's what's going to make us successful a year from now, is the people that we have involved with us. Without people, we become nothing as an organization. And so regardless of the new programs we put in place or the new trails we build, those are all going to happen, but they happen because of people. And the more we can strengthen and engage with the community, you know, it's the staff, it's the volunteers that do this work, not me. I just get to sit up here, and the more that they can be a part of who we are as our recovery, not only from the derecho but the pandemic, the better off we'll be as an organization.
David?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jason and his team and their board for this program and for inviting John and me to talk about this, and just to acknowledge that while John and I are on the stage, there are an awful lot of nonprofit leaders in the community doing really good work, and I would agree that our sites took a body blow physically that most did not, but everyone's been struggling through this, and it's a really hard time to be a nonprofit leader. So thank you, Jason, for what you're doing as well. I would want to say in a year from now that the people that we engage in Bruce Moore and try to help people fall in love with Bruce Moore the way we do evolved with us. I would want to be able to say that instead of wishing we had the Joffrey Ballet and wishing we had the classics of Bruce Moore, wishing we had blues more and the stuff we used to do, that people were able to evolve and adapt with us as we enhance our impact, as we grow in different ways. The outcome, the result of a place like Bruce Moore and the Indian Creek Nature Center and the History Center is more important than the specific outputs and the specific little programs. So I would want to be able to say that people stuck with the spirit of what we were trying to do and got engaged with some familiar programs, but also some new things too.
Yeah.
We're not returning to normal. We're shooting for much more than normal was.
Yeah.
We want to be abnormal.
Well,
We can still call you if we want to bring the Joffrey back to town, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's twice. Hampshire brought him twice. We'll take him a third time.
Okay. I want to know what to tell my boss,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
during my complaint session.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Remember, you can become a member of the History Center if you aren't already. If you would join me in thanking Mike and Esther Wilson again for their support of this amazing program. And if you would thank our guests, David Janssen and John Myers.
I just want to make a comment. I haven't really ever met John, and we met David once when you took us on a Nooks and Crannies tour. I'm so impressed with the quality of leadership that these men have expressed tonight. I'm just really grateful for that.
thank you.
Well, on that note, Jenny will eventually tell me who the next guest will be, and we'll invite you all back. So thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks, Rob.
Absolutely.